very generous remarks, Peter and I. I grew up with a kind of disappointed utopian in the sense that my father was a member of something called the Independent Labour Party and had joined it in the 30s, and I thought maybe we would talk a bit about the kind of Britain we would like to see, because I remember growing up with this man who, and my impression of a kind of the good life, of the good country, would have been a country in which people were members of the Cyclist Touring Club, read Shaw and Wells, and didn't drink very much, because he was, like a lot of people, quite teetotal. Of course, he was a disappointed man in that particular sense, because none of that happened. So when we talk about the kind of country that Britain might be, I'm well aware that the utopian view of it is not a very helpful one. Jean mentioned the complexity of what Britain is and how difficult it is to define. I think if you come from Scotland, as I do, sometimes you think, with great immodesty I have to say, that actually only if you're from Scotland do you understand the idea of Britishness, because the English have never had to understand it. Because even the saintly George Orwell, when he wrote about his country, he often got confused between England and Britain. The two places were the same thing. And Britain, to many people in England, has been Greater England, really, rather than a union of two countries, or even three countries if you include the earlier conjunction with Wales. So I think I've now become quite an unfashionable, I mean, not that I was ever fashionable, but my point of view in Scotland is now not fashionable. I consider myself to be British, Scottish if you like as well. I don't really care about that, so about either thing. You can call me either thing, it doesn't worry me, but British certainly has been an important part of my life. Perhaps because I grew up at a certain time, in a certain kind of family, with a certain view of history, which was taught in my school. Now, to come straight to the point really, when we talk about the future of Britain, I think one thing you should consider is whether Britain will exist to its present geographical extent in, say, 20 years. And the conventional wisdom in Scotland is always that devolution set in train a process with one inevitable end, which was independence. It's difficult for me, or for I think even for a pollster, to know if that's really true. I certainly in Scotland never detect, when I go there, never detect a great kind of groundswell of opinion for independence. But it may exist. It certainly exists in cyberspace. There's always people called cybernats who are continually typing away. I think too that when the recession happened and when the UK government was forced to nationalise the Bank of Scotland, Halifax Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland, that was a tremendous kind of shake up in Scotland. That gave people a sense of shock and surprise. And when Ireland collapsed and Iceland, the Alex Salmond, the SNP leader's view of this thing called the Arc of Prosperity, which ran apparently from Dublin to Reykjavik and then on to Oslo and would in future run through Edinburgh, that's obviously taken a severe knock. On the other hand, I would think, although again this is speculation on my part, the coming of David Cameron, if he does come, and if the Tory party do win the next election, would tend to make people in Scotland feel that they had less in common with London than they do now, obviously so, because you've got Gordon Brown, who comes from Fife, like I do, and there he is, and however unpopular he may be, he's at least Scottish. So I think that would, so it's really difficult to know exactly where all this is going, but I think it's certainly uncertain and debatable as to the kind of future extent of the United Kingdom. The other thing I would say briefly, because I know Peter has to have his 5 minutes, is that you know, what happens in kind of nations, I think, it's the kind of replacement of one national memory with another. And I grew up remembering all kinds of things. I mean, I was surrounded, for instance, by the Royal Navy because we lived close to the naval dockyard. I had steam engines that crossed the Forth Bridge in front of my house, which were named after Derby winners or characters from Walter Scott novels. I listened to the BBC Children's Hour. So I had a very, and the Queen would come occasionally and see a ship go on, pass through the park. So all these things kind of influenced the way I thought of things and the way many, many people thought of things. And I sensed that that kind of national memory may be replaced by a different one or even a better one, but it's going to die out when generation now in their 60s, or maybe a bit younger, passes away. So the sense of kind of expectation of what this country should be is bound to change as well. I remember when Joe Klein wrote a piece in the New Yorker on Tony Blair in 1997. He said Blair was he was the first non-imperial prime minister. That, Thatcher had memories of the war, that even Major kind of worshipped Churchill and so on, and that Blair was not an imperial prime minister. But in fact, that was utterly, in my view, completely wrong. Blair is one of the most imperial prime ministers we've had for a long time. And he had a kind of sense of Britain's mission in the world, and Douglas Hurst's famous thing about we had to punch above our weight and so on and so forth. I sense that that is finally going to stop. And if I chose an adjective for Britain in the next 20, 30 years, I would say the adjective is smaller. It's going to feel like a smaller place. We may build an aircraft carrier, and Ireland at what we do, because if you live in Glasgow, it's a good job to build an aircraft carrier, or in Rosyth, or in Devon. And I quite like seeing people employed in what I think is traditional skilled work, but those little things apart, I would really doubt that people in this country in 20, 30, say, could look back and think that we had once sent many troops to Iraq, many troops to Afghanistan, and unbelievably, and even this to me is becoming almost unbelievable now, that we once had enough kind of economic and military strength to send a task force to the South Atlantic in 1982. All those things to me look like the very kind of end game of a period of British history, which is bound to stop quite soon. So I think it's going to be a smaller kind of country, and perhaps a more troubled one, but we can talk about that.
Thank you.